Today, we're tackling the 5 most common arguments I hear against house churches. For years, I believed many of these arguments myself. If you've ever held one of these beliefs and learned something different today, please drop it in the comments below. All right, let's dive in. Reason number 1 is one of the most often I hear. It's that the early church met in the temple as seen in Acts chapter 2. So we should follow the example by meeting in big buildings. And I think this is a huge misunderstanding of what was actually occurring when it mentions that they met in the temple. Let's look at what was really happening. I had a picture in my mind when I would read that they met in the temple, that the Christians were meeting in a big building with lots of seating, exactly like churches look today. The area they did meet in was not an enclosed building like churches today. It was a long covered walkway or colonnade supported by rows of marble columns, which gave shade. There were not pews, but people could stand or sit on the ground and discuss topics freely. Also, there was no cost to go to this area. It was a public location that the church did not have to pay to construct or to utilize. If we want to use the church meeting in the temple as an example to follow, let's try to find a similar location today. So that location should be free. It should be open to the public and not just the church. It should provide shade from the sun or from weather. And a modern day church does not check any of those boxes. They cost the church hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. They are not in public spaces for anyone to use or to overhear the discussion, and they are fully enclosed. I would argue that a much closer example to what they were doing in our context would be a large, free public pavilion in a park in your city. This is actually something our church has done. We have several house churches in our area, and we come together and meet in a pavilion. Okay, to conclude on this one, we can make a huge error when we misunderstand the original context of what was actually happening and imply that we should now, as a result, spend millions of dollars to construct our own buildings when that isn't even anywhere close to what was really being done. All right, let's tackle the next one. It is the idea that the early church met in homes only due to persecution, meaning that it was not done by choice, but because they had no other option. The issue with this line of thought is that the early church fathers from the first 3 centuries vocalized that it was indeed a choice they were making to meet in homes instead of designated buildings. I've gone through several of these quotes in the past, so I'll make it quick and just cover one for you today. This quote is from Origen. He says, "We refuse to build lifeless temples to the giver of all life. Our bodies are the temple of God. If anyone defiles the temple of God by lust or sin, he himself will be destroyed by acting impiously towards the true temple. Of all the temples spoken of in this sense, the best and most excellent was the pure and holy body of our Savior Jesus Christ. He said to them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it again.' This he said of the temple of his body. When they reproach us for not deeming it necessary to worship the divine being by raising lifeless temples, we set before them our temples." Now, I want you to note how Origen specifies that he was making a personal choice and that they were refusing to build temples or buildings. He also mentions that the people of God are the temple, which is in complete agreement with the Apostle Peter and Apostle Paul and what they believed and taught in the scriptures. So many in the early church believed that they shouldn't construct buildings independent of whether there was persecution. And the church in China is also a very good example on this topic of house churches and persecution. As persecution has dropped in certain seasons, some churches have decided to construct buildings to meet in. The church leaders have lamented predictable results that have occurred after their churches have made this decision, in which they discuss higher costs, power concentration among leaders, corruption, and it's turned many in the church into passive consumers. Unfortunately, just so much changes when we go from a small group to a large crowd. And these issues have prompted the Chinese church leaders to reevaluate their church structures and then move back to home-based models for sustained zeal and intimacy. So China has had experience with both house churches and big building churches, and many choose house churches, citing all the negative problems that come from a bigger meeting format. So you can clearly see from both the early church fathers and from churches in persecuted countries today that this is not due to persecution, but these Christians are actually preferring to meet in homes. Now let's jump to item 3 on the list, which is that house churches can lead to heresy or bad doctrine. The general assumption for this is because house church leaders many times are not formally trained in seminaries. But my question is, where is a seminary shown as an example for leadership in the New Testament? The example I see in the New Testament is the disciples following and learning from Jesus and then doing what he did. That was the example for the apostles. And then Paul explains the model for all future generations. Paul states that the church is where people should be equipped to do ministry, with one of those giftings being to teach. So it's not that the early church was sending people to seminaries. Future church leaders were raised up in the church. Something we also have to keep in mind is that all of these passages regarding church leadership and doctrine, they were written in the context of a house church setting. So my question is, wouldn't the original context be the most applicable for these passages? The idea that house churches could easily have heresy seems to have the assumption that a bigger church has a lesser chance of that. And we can all think of several megachurches that are preaching a false prosperity gospel. Last time I checked, the prosperity gospel preachers were not starting house churches. I have also seen so often a very gifted pastor with questionable character or doctrinal beliefs, but is allowed to carry on because if the pastor was removed, the church would lose a majority of its members, and as a result, lose a majority of its money. So the church more looks like a cult of personality in which the people are following the main pastor more than they are following the elders or Christ. And the fact is that in every church, regardless of size, that this has the danger. That's why the Bible is filled with warnings about false teachers. But here's the reality I've seen in house churches. On a personal note, I am greatly impressed by the teachers that we have in our house churches, both on the time that they put into preparing and the quality of messages at our church. Many of the messages actually have more depth than a message that I hear at many churches on a given Sunday. And I found this is a problem in many churches, especially in attractional models, that they tend to cater the message to the least knowledgeable person attending. And with hundreds of people on a given Sunday, the messages can really lack substance. I'll be making a video in the future about church elders and what elders actually look like in the New Testament. I think that video will really help strengthen house churches if we know this biblical pattern of leadership. So subscribe since you don't want to miss that video. Number 4 on the list is that people prefer big churches in westernized nations. I know from personal experience up until about 5 years ago that I was greatly preferring big churches, but I wanted to stress that the reason was predominantly due to ignorance on my part. I was simply unaware of many of the benefits of house churches and why the early church met in homes. Even the church in China that we just discussed seemed to be unaware of the benefits that they actually had in house churches, and they realized all of these benefits were lost when they started transitioning to big building churches. Many Christians simply don't know what they are missing. The second reason is what I call competing desires. An example of competing desires in everyday life is how we all desire to be in shape. We all desire to eat right, but we also really like to eat donuts. In the same way, many of us want to have a strong church community and to be able to use our spiritual gifts at church. But at the same time, we really like having a church meeting where we can just sit, listen, and receive without having to contribute anything ourselves. House church is a lot more work, but it is so worth it. This is how it always works in the kingdom. What we think will bring us joy and contentment is usually different than what actually brings us joy and contentment. All right. And now number 5, the last item on the list is what do we do about kids? The first thing I want to share is that it is not the church's job to raise your kids up in the faith. Deuteronomy 6 gives the instruction of each parent raising their kids in the scriptures and the way of God. This is one of the most referenced portions of scripture by the Jews still to this day. And it says, "And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up." I have seen from personal experience that the kids who follow the Lord the closest when leaving their house are the ones who saw it modeled in their home. Do you want your kids to worship God? I'd say the best method is to have them see you worshiping with all of your heart, both in church and also at home. We discussed previously how house churches enable us to help the poor and the needy. What if instead of getting our kids to love Jesus with entertainment from a youth group, that we instead have them join us when giving out food and clothing to the poor? This will speak more powerfully than any youth group ever could. Start getting them into tithing and have them come up with their own creative ways to help the poor and the needy, and then help them to do it. Parents have way more of an impact on their kids' faith than a 1 hour a week in a youth group. Do not delegate the role of raising your kids in the Lord to your church. That is your job. But let's get back to the topic of house church. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. For our Northside group that I am a part of, we have a ton of young kids. And as a result, my 2-year-old absolutely loves church. She strums my guitar during the week and says, "church" to me, which gives me so much joy. And then on Sundays, we can tell her that, hey, we're going to have church today. And she gets really excited. So I personally believe, as a general rule, that once kids are a certain age where they can understand the content for the adult gathering, I would encourage them to attend the adult gathering. It is a little odd to have kids attend a kids' church all the way until 18. Then when they get to make their own decisions on whether to attend church when they move out of the house, they never actually have attended church with adults before. And studies have shown that the number one predictor of longevity of faith is that children have interactions and deep relationships with non-peer Christians, meaning people of older age groups. So bringing the kids into the adult group at an earlier age may not be a bad thing. My ultimate vision is to have dozens of house churches in each city. Once you have just a handful of house churches, you could easily have many similar aged kids for a youth group that someone with a gifting with kids could help lead on, say, a Wednesday night. But again, this Wednesday night group would just be a supplemental thing. So we can see that whatever method we choose for teaching our kids at church, it is a supplemental secondary issue. The main issue is, what are we doing with the other 167 hours out of the week? So that officially wraps up our list of the 5 most common arguments against house churches. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which one of these arguments did you used to believe, and what evidence helped change your mind? Drop it in the comment below. If this video gave you a new perspective, please like and subscribe. I have many future videos in development, especially that one on New Testament elders. So hit that notification bell so that you don't miss them. And finally, check out this video right here, as I think you will really enjoy it. God bless and have a great day.